Ho, 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 and welcome to the Azure Advent Calendar. Today, it's December 22nd, and we are talking about Azure Policy. My name is Eric. I'm a global subject lead for cloud compute in SoftwareOne. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Azure and Cloud and Data Center Management. I'm a LinkedIn Learning trainer running some podcasts, an Azure meetup, and all the stuff. And today, I will help you through the Azure Policy topic. So once again, thank you to the organizers of the Azure Advent Calendar. Thank you to all the contributors. You've seen a lot of videos already, and now it's short before Christmas, so the last videos are coming in. Today, 22nd of December, and there's a video about Azure Policy. Before we join into the policy topic, let's just once again have a look on the overall Azure governance topic. So when we have a look into Azure, there are a lot of things that belong to the Azure governance. And one of the main things, and this is what we are talking about today, is the Azure Policy. Azure Policy as an enforcement, compliance, and assessment and remediation tool to really keep control over your environment. I normally refer to the Azure policies as let's say the play rules for Azure. So if you want to play a game, you need some rules, and that happens with the policies. We also have some other features like blueprints, like the resource graph, management groups that can help us to distribute access and also policies to different subscriptions. And one very important thing that everybody needs is some cost management. So today, we're just picking out one particular point, and that's the Azure Policy. If you have a look into all the other videos that are already online or that are coming, you will see also videos on all the other topics that are out there. If we have a look into the architecture view, then you can see that the policy engine is inside of the Azure Resource Manager. The Azure Resource Manager is handling all our requests towards Azure. So every time you are using the portal, the CLI, any third-party tool, any management tool, whatever, and you're trying to create, modify, or delete a resource, then the Azure Resource Manager will handle this and will communicate with the resource provider you see underneath, like the virtual machine resource provider, the storage resource provider, and all of this. And every time we do something, the policy engine is in between and is checking if our actions are allowed, are sticking to the policies, and are fine for us. We have on the left-hand side the option to bring in policies, but also role-based access and some ARM templates via Azure Blueprints. And on the right, we have the opportunity to go with the Azure Resource Graph to check our environment, to really query our environment, and to make things better there. So that's the overall overview, and what we want to have a look on today is just the policy engine, just a tiny little thing in the middle that's sitting on top of the Azure Resource Manager and is helping us to make our environment like we want it. So let's start with some policy basics first. So when we have an overview about policies, there are a lot of built-in policies brought into by Microsoft. We will have a look on those later. We have the opportunity to build our custom policies for all the resource types you can see out there. We have the opportunity for real-time policy evaluation and enforcement if we want this. And we also will have a compliance evaluation on a periodic time frame so that we can see is our Azure environment in our compliance state that we want to. One pretty cool feature, and we will cover this in the end, is the VM ingest policies, where you really can configure ingest and also in-resource settings. You will see this later. Policies apply at scale. You can start at the management group level and go down all the tiny little bits that you have there. You can apply them to the entire organization. You can apply multiple policies, you can aggregate them, you can also take policies from one environment to another one, and even if you want to, you are able to exclude certain resources, resource groups or whatever from your policies, maybe because that's your sandbox, your playground or whatever. A good thing, we have a remediation, so you have a real-time remediation and a remediation also on existing resources. So this is really bringing a life cycle into your resource management, from setting up the rules, about managing your rules, up to remediate everything that's not sticking to your rules. If we have a look into the resource policies in Microsoft Azure, then as I said already, we can set them on management groups, on subscriptions, or on resource group levels. And the policy is kind of an allow or define system. So it works basically with an if-then condition. So if you want to do this, if you want to create this, or if this resource exists, then this must be the state, this must happen, this is allowed, this is not allowed, whatever. And as always in Microsoft Azure, everything is created via a JSON file, so let's have a look into this later. So we built this if and then via JSON. There are a lot of actions, so every time we talk about then, there must be an action that is executed if the if statement is valid. And there are some popular actions. There are also some preview actions. I don't list them here right now, but the most popular actions are the append actions, where you're able to put something onto your deployment. So for example, if you deploy this and that, then just add, for example, this IP address to the scope of allowed IP addresses. Or something like this. Then you have an audit action, so that's actually not doing anything specific to your resources or to your deployment, it's just auditing. That's very important if you want to just be notified, if you want to just write down something happened that was against the rules or even with the rules, but you just need to note down that it happened and why it happened. There's also an audit if not exists. That's very important when it comes to agents, for example. You want to have all your systems in Azure Monitor. You want to have your systems in the Azure Security Center. Then it's interesting to figure out if those agents and if those configurations exist. And there's also the responding deploy if not exists action, where you can say, okay, if it's not there, then please remediate it. A very popular thing, it's a deny action. So actually, I do not allow this. I don't like this. No, you can't go any step further. That's happening with the deny system. There's also an action, it's called the disabled action. This means that the policy will be evaluated, but it's the action, the then part is disabled, so it won't be executed. Pretty important, especially when you are in testing, when you are starting to use policies on an existing environment, because you don't want to crush your whole environment just by setting some policies. And there's also one pretty important action, it's the modify action. That's, for example, pretty heavily used for tags. So every time you want to add a tag or replace a tag, or maybe also remove a tag, then you will do it with the modify action. As I said already, there are a lot of built-in policies. We will find a lot of policies around security. Like I said already, for example, for the Azure Security Center enablement, we have some guest configuration baselines. We will find some Key Vault certificate policies. They are pretty new because they came up at Microsoft Ignite in 2019. We have some NSG rules. We now have some rules on AKS and AKS Engine, and also rules for RBAC role assignments. So that's all covering the security thing. Then also we find some regulatory compliance policies like ISO, NIST, PCI, FedRAMP, and so on. We really can check, okay, is our environment sticking to the rules that are set by, let's say, an ISO 27001. That's important because in there you have some rules about monitoring, logging, backupping and stuff. And so with this policy sets, you can say, okay, is my environment able to stick to those compliance rules? One of the most used features when it comes to policies are tagging rules or tagging policies, require tags, add or replace tags, inherit tag from a resource group, or append a tag. So every time you want to have a resource in Azure and you need some cost management in the end, it leads back to tagging. One hand is for cost management. On the other hand side, you can use tags for automation. For example, you can use tags for your day-to-day operations, like setting downtimes, like setting your maintenance windows or something like this. So tags are very important, and that's one thing you can handle with policies. We can also have resource standardization, like things that are allowed locations, backup of VMs is necessary, or allowed and non-allowed resource providers. So I don't want you to create a public IP, for example, then I can set this in a policy, also very famous. And then also we are able to do some cost management, like replace the allowed VMs. The most expensive VM now is the M416. If you enable this with a Windows Server and a SQL Server Enterprise on top of it, it costs around, I think, $220,000 a month. Maybe you don't want this in your test environment so that everybody's able to create something like this. So what you can set is a policy for the allowed VM SKUs. and just making sure that, for example, by default, you can just create VMs up to 8 or 16 cores, and then you know the amount of money you will spend on each VM is limited to a certain amount of money, and it won't reach the 200K or something. There are some things I see quite often out there, and I call them the recommended policies. Normally, we find policies on the subscription, on the management group level for geo-compliance and data sovereignty. So this means allow the locations you're fine with. Don't deploy as a European customer your HR database to Brazil. Don't put your customer database into China. Okay, there you need another contract, but different story. So really settle down for this and that. We allow the European data centers, for example. Or as a US customer, I will allow the US data centers because that's the fine thing for me, but I won't allow the Indian data centers, for example. Bring in everything you need for cost management, like allowed SKUs, allowed storage types. That's very important. And also figure out your required tags, because that's pretty important. If you don't do it at the beginning, to handle this afterwards, to remediate this afterwards, is a lot of work to figure out what tags do I have to place, who's responsible for it, what's the right tag, and so on. So it's way better if you define this upfront. What's interesting, if you use policies and you use, for example, things like deny and like audit, then please check your activities and log them. Because if you have an audit log set, so then something will be written to your audit log. If you have a deny, then you will also see it in your audit. But if someone runs against a deny rule over and over and over again, then it's the main question, why is he doing it? Maybe he's not aware of what he's doing there. Maybe there's an automated deployment failing and failing over again without anybody noticing it. So please really have a look into your activities, have a look into the logs, and really check them for what's going on here. What are the audit events? What are maybe deny events that happened, and who raised them? If it happens from time to time, maybe then they knew it. If it happens on a regular basis of 10 minutes, then maybe it's an automatic deployment that's failing. So you don't want this. Make sure to enforce your security. That's one of the things that policies can really well do for you. You will see in a second that we also have some auto-populated policies for the Azure Security Center. And if you're running VMs in Azure, and especially if your VMs are no longer attached to a normal domain, then please go and configure your ingest settings. As I said, we will cover this a bit later. If we have a look into the Azure portal and go into the policy space, then you will see some very important topics first. As you can see, we're starting in the overview page. I ripped it down to one certain scope, so I don't want to show you all my environments I have access to and all my subscriptions I have access to, but you really could go here and extend your scopes that you are talking about. So in this overview, you can see your resource compliance. You can also see your initiatives and policies, and I will explain in a second what's the difference between them. And also you can see the policies that are actually assigned, and then you can see how it was changing over the last days, over the last weeks. So there are some overview panes here for compliance and remediation. We will have a look in a second, but let's start with the definitions first. So if you go into the definitions, you will find all the predefined, pre-built policies that are brought in by Microsoft. And I remember a time when this was a very short list, but right now, if you have a look and you scroll through here, that's a super long list right now. And in this list, you will find those two icons. You will find things like this here, outed virtual machines without disaster recovery configured, and that's a definition type called policy. So that's a single policy, one rule that is defined and that you can apply. If you have a look at this tiny little icon here, then you can see this is a so-called policy initiative. An initiative is a grouping of policies, and as you can see, for example, if you have a look into the outed NIST controls and deploy specific VM extensions, then you can see that's a set of 799 policies brought together. Imagine you have to set 799 policies by hand into your environment, then you will go crazy at all. If you do it with those policy initiatives, then you can group them together. And if we have a look into such a definition and such an initiative, then you can see that's really a big set that will be deployed here, covering multiple topics. And that's really making it easier. So for example, if you define between test and dev and prod, then you could, for example, build your own dev, test, and prod initiative and just combine together things. And as you can see, there are different policies with different effects, like audit if not exists, deploy if not exists, and so on. And that's 799 rules in total. So quite a lot. Let's have a look into one of the most common policies we see. If we have a look into the location, there you can see that there are two important rules. That's the allowed locations and allowed locations for resource groups policy. And there's also one, audit resource location matches resource group location. That's very important because the allowed location really just sticks to the resources. A resource group could be created in every other location. This is why there are two rules for this. And it's a best practice to put the resource group and its resources into the same location. Why? If your resource group sticks in a region that maybe has an outage or a fail or whatever, and it contains resources of another region, all the resources in the another region will run without any problem. But you cannot manage them anymore because the management information is stored in the resource group and also in the resource group location. So it's a best practice to keep resource groups and locations in the same area. And this is why we have this policy here called audit resource location matches resource group location. But now to understand how a policy works, let's just have a look into the allowed locations policy. And as you can see, there are always some properties in here, like what's the policy type, that's a built-in policy, it's called allowed location, there's a description what this does, and then you can see there are also some parameters that are required. For sure, if we want to set the list of allowed locations, then we need a parameter with the list of allowed locations, so that's pretty fine. And then you can see there is a policy rule, and that's actually really the policy that is working. And in this policy rule, we have this if, and then also the then part. And in the if part, you can see if all of those things are in place, like if the field location is not in the list of allowed locations, okay, if the field location is not global, and if the field type is not Azure Active Directory B2C directories, because they are not sticking to a location, and if you have a global thing, then it's not sticking to a location, then the effect is deny. So pretty easy. I will set here West Europe, for example, and if I deploy something and the location states, I don't know, East US, then it's not in the list West Europe, and so it's out. And then the effect will come in and will say, I deny this action you're asking for. Let's jump back into the policies and let's have a look into one of the maybe more complex things. For example, go in here and say deploy diagnostic settings for Service Bus to Log Analytics Workplace. As you can see, the policy is getting bigger and bigger. We have a lot more parameters here because we need some profiles, we need some information about the Log Analytics workspace and the metrics that should be enabled. But in the end, as you can see, the policy rule is pretty much the same. It's just if your resource type is a Service Bus namespace, then I need an effect, and then we have all the topics that must be done. And then you can see there's a deployment action done in here, for example. So that's almost what happens with every policy you create. And if you say, oh, that's pretty nice, there are a lot of policies pre-built or built in, but I don't find the policy I'm searching for, then you always have the option to build your own initiative or your own policy definition. And I did it here. For example, I build a policy just for restricting public IPs. And that's following the same structure. As you can see, there are some properties for it. There are no parameters right now because I really fixed it down here. And then there's an if and a then. And then I just put down if the type is public IP address, then the location West Europe, and if all of this, then deny. So if you want to create a public IP address in West Europe, I will not allow it because maybe I'm the master of public IP addresses and we're not doing it in West Europe or in North Europe or whatever. And that's a way how you can create all your policies on your own. So you really can do it. And as you can see, that's a JSON file. So policy as code is one of the main words if you want to use policies in a broad range. Then you will come back to this part and do it all in code. So there's no visual way to configure your policies. It's always done by code. If you now want to assign such a policy, then you have to select it, or you go to the assignments and do it from there. And then you can go and say, I want to assign this. And then you can say, okay, where should I assign it? Is it on the management group? Is it on a subscription level? Where do I want to have it? Are there any exclusions that are important? Like this resource group, the sandbox resource group, should be without any. Then just go in and say there is an exclusion for it. Then you have an assignment name, you have a description, you can say if the policy is enabled or disabled, pretty important. You can have a look, there are no parameters in my policy, and then you can say if there is some remediation task in there, and if there's a remediation task, I also need some kind of an access to do this. And this is why we are able, so for example, if we have to deploy if not exists and the modify effect, then we must be able to authenticate against the resource manager to do some changes, and then we are able to create a managed identity for the policy engine to do those tasks in our name here. I don't have it right now, so I just go to review and create. I say, okay, we restrict the public IP addresses for our tenant root group. I just click on create and I'm done. My policy is set, my policy will be created. Right now they're missing rights. I have to go deeper than on the tenant root group, but no matter what. That's all. That's how you can assign a policy. And as soon as you have assigned a policy, then you can see them here in the assignments. And as mentioned earlier, what you can see is there is a data protection and an ASC default policy initiative assigned. As you can see, the ASC default has 98 policies in there, and they are there by default, and you can use them to make sure that the basic security settings are done for your environment. And as you can also see, my restrict public IP address is brought in here. So as soon as you build your policy, the backend engines will start to do their work, and then it shows up after some time in the policy compliance state. And as you can see, for example, I'm compliant with the data protection policy. I'm not compliant with the Azure Security Center default rule, and my restrict public IP address is not yet started. Not started means the compliance assessment has not yet started. It will take normally up to 30 minutes, roundabout, till the first compliance status is done, and then it will be done on a regular basis, but it's not a real-time view when you have a look into compliance. The overall setting, like I now cannot build new public IPs, that's in place as is, as soon as possible. But the compliance setting to check if there were some policies or some public IPs already in the not allowed region, this will take some time. And also important, a policy will never change an existing resource if it has a deny. So if you say, I don't allow public IPs with a deny rule, this will mean you never are able to create new again, but it won't delete all the old ones. That's pretty important. It won't do this. So you have to do it on your own. This is why you also get this compliance view. So much to the overview. But now the main question is, okay, maybe you have a lot of policies. How are they processed? How is it working? What happens if there's an overlap? What happens if there are maybe some configurations that are against each other or something like this? Let's have a look into this. As I said, the user is going to put some code into our Azure Resource Manager. Maybe he's doing it via the portal, maybe he's doing it via PowerShell, CLI, or is using a DevOps pipeline or whatever, no matter what. So we create our resource configuration request and go ahead and put it into Azure Resource Manager. And the first thing that will happen is that the Azure Policy Engine takes the package and has a look into what's going on there, what should happen there, is it okay, is it not okay? And there's a specific order of evaluation. So first, it will check for all the policies that are disabled because they, well, you know, don't have to be done. Then all the append and modify actions are checked, and that's pretty simple why it's in this order, because if you append something or you modify something, for example, like the tags, then you won't hit the deny or audit policies. For example, if you say, If you don't have the tag set, then I will deny the deployment. If you have the modify up front to say, or the append, please add this tag to your deployment, then you won't hit the deny rule. So that's the easy way how it's done. So after append and modify, the deny rule is checked, because if something is denied, we don't have to audit it. Otherwise, we would have a double audit. So there would be the audit rule that hits, and then the deny rule would hit again. So you have 2 entries in your audit log. So this is why the order of evaluation is in this way. If the deny hits, it's denied, there's no further action done. And if it's allowed, but it must be audited, then it comes down to the audit. And if all those things are done, then bam, we have our cloud resource and we have it configured as we want. And after this, we go into the next stage and have a look into the deploy if not exists and audit if not exists policies. So if the resource is there something that should be in there that I have to deploy? Is there something that's not deployed, that's not deployable, where maybe there's also no deploy configuration? Then please audit this thing and let me know about the problems we have in there. So that's the thing that always happens when you do something in the Azure portal or via PowerShell or whatever. And I can easily show you how this works. So let's go into the portal and say we create a new resource, and let's maybe call this a public IP address. So here's my public IP address. I want to create this, and I would like to take an IPv4, and we take this. That's the Azure Advent Calendar, public IP. Let's have a look if this name works. We take this as a dynamic one. We don't need a DNS label. I will take this into a subscription, and we create a new resource group. It's the resource group Azure Advent. Okay, and we take this to West Europe. And now let's create this. And as you can see, there is always this tiny little validating button. You've seen it. Validating always means I'm checking against the policy now. So in this moment, the policy engine runs and says, okay, he wants to do something. There's the configuration package. Let me have a look. Is there any policy that I have to do? Append, whatever, deny it, whatever. And as we can see, we have a validation error now. And as you can see, my resource was disallowed by policy, request disallowed by policy, and I can also see what is the policy. It's called my restrict public IP policy. So no chance to do it. I'm out. I cannot configure this because it was disallowed by my administrator. And that's the thing that always happens. And no matter if I now try it via PowerShell or I try it via the CLI or whatever, it will always come to the same result. And even a CD pipeline out of Azure DevOps, for example, will also come to the same result. There is no way to do this configuration at the moment. So that's what happens when we process those policies. But now I told you earlier there is something called in-guest policy. So what happens there? I would call the Azure so-called Azure guest configuration or Azure policy guest configuration, or there's some names around there. I would call it the GPO on steroids because it's pretty cool what they built. And now let's have a look into why they did it and how they did it. So if we have a look into group policy, we all know, I think it's now more than 20 years old. So group policies are pretty old, and everybody of us loves this old group policy management editor. It was always a pain to do some filtering in there to find the right policy. There were so many thousands of policies. Always fun to work with it. But now when we are moving into cloud environments, group policies are kind of lacking because cloud machines having a very short lifespan. We can see containerized workloads that spin up and shut down in minutes or hours. So the processing of group policies that sometimes take several reboots or something like this is not really fitting to the needs. Also, our developers want to deploy fast and test fast and remove something and recreate something and change it and try and whatever. And a very fixed policy, a group policy, as we had it in the past, where you always have this group policy administrator that's the super guru of your whole environment, doesn't fit into place. And also, if we have a look into certain projects that are more going to the cloud native or cloud agnostic, part, then you can see that many of those VMs never see a domain again. They won't be domain joined because all the applications running in there, they are doing Azure AD authentication or other modern authentications. So there's no requirement anymore to put them into a domain. So quite hard to then work with group policies. And also, not all the resources we use know about group policies, so it's really a question, how can I fit this together? Then I would have my group policies for my VMs, and I would still need the Azure policies for my other resources to be secure. How can I manage this together? And that answer is Azure Policy. So there was also one issue with the group policy. The operations and security team always needed some read-only access and some flexibility with the group policies, and there was a lot of discussion about who is setting what and who is checking what, and bam, that's nothing for the fast cloud world anymore. And normally by design it cannot be applied to cloud scopes. It's still set to operational organizational units in an Active Directory domain. So to build your whole cloud environment of subscriptions, management groups, resource groups, and all the prod dev test things in there, you would also have to create this in your Active Directory to really work with group policies. So the easy and flexible assignments we have with the management groups, for example, and the inclusions and exclusions and all of this is way, way better in Azure Policy. So if we bring it on the plate and try to compare it, then you can see, okay, we have a group policy on the one hand side with a lot of access, and we have the Azure Policy guest configuration on the other side. One of the things that wasn't asked from the past was I need on-demand self-service for my policies. For group policy, no way. Frustrating for the developers because it was ever unclear if the processing has completed. It was never they were never sure if there were some changes. They had to check this. Normally, a dev was not able to have a look into the group policy management console, and so on and so on. In Azure Policy, we can define the policies in our ARM deployment as part of the application. So we can put in all the security rules required as part of the deployment. So we can make sure if the deployment is run, also the policies are in place. So there is no waiting for processing anymore. It is there, and I have defined it. Another thing, broad network access. For group policy, we must be domain joined. As I said already, not every machine in the cloud is domain joined. For policies, no matter what, if the machine is domain joined or if it's not domain joined or it will change its domain joined from day to day, no worries, your policy configuration will stick through. Resource pooling is a thing. Group policies are fitting just to Microsoft resources. It's not compatible with PaaS services. It's not compatible with anything else in the group policy management console. You cannot add some cloud resources, nothing. Azure Policy, it's fully Microsoft implemented. We have ingest policies for Linux and Microsoft workloads. We have ingest policies nowadays for AKS, for Kubernetes services. And also we have it integrated into the overall Azure Policy console. So you can also manage all your PaaS services and so on the same thing. Yeah, elasticity, group policy, not easy to manage kettle. Yeah, it's hard. If something changes very fast, group policy was always hard to figure out. And also the measuring, there was no real telemetry. So really to know, was my group policy applied? Is everything working? Have all the rules been processed and so on, was kind of a problem most of the times. In Azure Policy, we have our reports on temporary nodes. We can make sure that everything works. We have our full telemetry through ARM, through the diagnostic logs, through all our audit logs. So it's always there. It's always in place. So pretty nice, I think. And if we have a look into all the policies that are built in, all the guest configurations that are built into Azure Policy, you can see them run through on the right side. Audits for Windows VMs, administrator groups, configurations in security options, in audit policies, in whatever. So that's a pretty cool thing they built there. There are a lot of rules in there. They're grouped by the overall configuration groupings because you cannot build in all the group policies, the thousands we had, into the policy system. So it was grouped a bit. And then you have a holistic view of the full compliance state across all your resources, in guest and also in the other things. What happens technically in the background is pretty easy. We have an Azure resource provider. It's called the Microsoft Guest Configuration Resource Provider, and there's a VM extension that will be deployed. It's the Microsoft.guest configuration extension, so pretty straightforward. And then we have a Windows service. If it's a Windows machine, that's the DSC, Desired State Configuration Service, working in the guest config on the program data. And then you have your DSC MOF files, and you have your resources in PowerShell Core 6.2 that are supporting this. Also referenced as like the DSC vNext or DSC version 2 or whatever. And if you have a Linux daemon, then it's a DSCD service doing all the same things. So it's also working with the desired state configuration daemon that is getting the configurations, is processing them inside the virtual machine, and is doing whatever is necessary to make the machine compliant to all our rules. Those agents are limited to normally 5% CPU usage, so they won't crash your VM, they won't kill you. That's pretty straightforward. Now, I know everybody has built quite a lot of group policies. So one thing that was built for the guest configuration policies, it's working together with the group policy DSC thing. So there was a community tool that was built to convert group policies into the DSC format, to bring them into DSC configurations. And that's now also supported with the policy guest configuration. So if you have your group policies, you can export them and then go ahead and convert them into DSC packages, do some PowerShell magic, and then you can import them into the Azure Policy Engine. So pretty nice. So you don't have to throw away all your work from the last years. You can just go ahead and do your stuff there. Okay, policy sounds pretty nice. So what's next? What do we have to take care of for 2020? As Christmas is approaching, we all should do some good ideas for 2020. There's one thing what we really have to take into consideration is the policy as code release. Managing policies at scale in a tenant is hard. So what you normally should do is create your policy definitions and your initiatives as code in your repository, test them with maybe an enforcement mode of disabled, then check the compliance states of the current environment, have a look what's going on there, and then go to the MSI permissions, do all the remediations you have to do to make sure you don't break your full environment, and then go ahead and deploy the full policy with the enforcement mode on enabled, and then you have a super cool thing. But if you want to do this all manually, that's quite hard. So think about policy as code. Integrate policies into your CI/CD pipeline. Do a continuous delivery, continuous deployment of your policies. Track your policies as code in your repository, in your Git repository or in your GitHub repository or wherever you want it, so that you also can follow the changes that happen to all those policies. Because, for example, this is something the policy portal in Azure is not giving you. There is no version history or something. If you change it, it's changed. You have to change it back. If you do policy as code, pretty cool. So take this on your list to learn and to check for next year. Another thing, pretty cool. So we've seen the in-guest policies now, but what's coming up more and more and more is policies for objects within a resource. Like what Microsoft brought out at Microsoft Ignite 2019 was the Azure Policy for Key Vault and Azure Policy for AKS and the AKS engine. Nice thing. There's a lot more coming, so keep your eyes open on the whole policy space if you want to configure your in-object resources. Yeah, and then there's a lot more. So they are sticking a lot to the regulatory compliance rules. You will see a lot more of those initiatives there. We go to the multi-tenancy support in Azure Lighthouse for all the MSPs out there or for customers that are running a multi-tenancy environment. There will be improvements for authoring and language improvement, like regular expressions, enforcement mode stuffs, working with arrays, and so on and so on. We will see some more resource manager modes, like we have the key vault, the AKS already. Let's see, we get the remediation for guest configuration policies. Nowadays, it's mostly audits. So there will be a lot more things coming. The whole lifecycle thing will be matured so that you really can manage it from beginning to end, from deployment to monitoring to reconfiguration and remediation. And also there will be more and more integrations into the partner tools like Azure DevOps, Azure Security Center, Azure Monitor that you can trigger and monitor and integrate it into each and every way. So take it for 2020, take Azure policies on your plate, learn it, use it, implement it, and monitor it. I hope you enjoyed the session. I wish you all a Merry Christmas. I wish you a good time with your families. Take some days off, calm down, have a good start into 2020, and see you next year. Thank you for attending.